Hey everyone, today we are going to be going over a starter Mythic Plus guide for the largely reworked dungeon Grim Batol. This video will be basically an overview guide of the dungeon for beginning Mythic Plus players. In the future, I will be doing a video on plus 10 guides for these Mythic Plus dungeons. I also did Grim Batol in a pug so you guys would get an idea of what the actual experience would be like pugging this dungeon. Let's get into it. The main caster for this area is the Twilight Earthcallers, who cast Mass Tremors, which is a big AoE hit and slow, so you will want to prioritize your kicks on this ability. Then you will want to use your spare kicks on Earth Bolts, which is a random target nature hit. The next mob we'll talk about is the big dragons in the beginning area. These are the Twilight Destroyers. They have a big AoE hit, which is also a knockback, so make sure you are positioning correctly so you are not knocked off the platforms. As well, this can be LOS, so you can move behind a wall for it if you can. The dragons will also debuff players with Twilight Flame, which is a shadow damage dot that leaves a puddle on the ground with each tick. So be mindful and don't drop those puddles in your safe LOS spots. The other mob in this area is the Twilight Overseers. They will occasionally enrage all the enemy mobs with reckless tactics. So tanks, make sure you are aware of this and use soothes if you can. Tanks, also be aware of the Arrive ability, which is a tank buster hit which increases the physical damage you take. In combination, these two can be very scary. So after you have done with these packs, you will find some red dragons which you can mount and do a bombing run on the trash packs between you and the first boss. The mounts have two abilities. One is called Engulfing Flames, which is your big hit and only has 5 stacks, so make sure you make them count. And the other is Searing Ember, which is your smaller damage ability that you can spam off cooldown. The most important pack that you want to prioritize is directly in front of General Umbriss. Otherwise, just try to make sure you are peppering the rest of the groups as much as possible. Moving on to the first boss in the dungeon, General Umbriss. General Umbriss has a couple different abilities, but the first one we're going to talk about is Commanding Roar. Commanding Roar is going to be the party-wide AoE hit, which also causes drakes to strafe across 3/4 of the platform shortly after each cast. Make sure after this mechanic you move back to the center of the platform to make it easier to move to the next safe area for once Commanding Roar is casted again to dodge the Drake breaths easier. From there, the boss will alternate on what ability he casts next. One, debuffing 3 players with Rock Spike, which knocks up the 3 players, damaging them and leaves behind a puddle on the ground for 2 minutes. I recommend dropping these puddles in the outer ring of the boss room, starting on the westernmost side at the entrance of the room, so that you will always have enough room to move when those dragons strafe across the platform. For tanks, be mindful of the Skull Splitter ability, which is a tank buster hit that applies heavy damage and a stacking bleed, so make sure you have a defensive to use for this ability and use a bleed cleanse as needed. Once we've completed in General Umbriss, we'll be moving towards Forgemaster Throngus' trash, but be careful, the boss does patrol this room, but he does stop and use a channel at the nearby lava, so you will have pockets of time to clear mobs in this area, but it does create swirlies that your team will need to avoid. So just be mindful and know his location at all times. In terms of trash, in this area the main caster is the Twilight Beguiler, whose ability is Seer Mind, which is a channel damage dealer and a stun, so you'll need to make sure to kick this ability. They also have a random target bolt ability, so use spare kicks on that, but prioritize Seer Mind. The main lieutenant mob in this area is the Molten Giant. These mobs have a big AoE hit called Molten Wake, which also puts a fire damage amp debuff on everyone in the party, so be mindful of the overlap of these abilities, and tanks, make sure you use defensives. Also, what's important, if you pull the next group of mobs with the Molten Giant together, the next group of mobs has a Shadow Flame tank buster from the Shadow Flame flame renders called Shadow Flame Slash. So tanks, be very mindful of this because you could have a lot of oncoming damage if you pull them incorrectly. Moving on to Forgemaster Throngus, the boss has 3 different weapons that he switches throughout the fight. Whenever he channels his new weapon, he does have some AoE damage to the group, so be mindful of that. But to start, he always uses his axe, which the ability for his axe is Fiery Cleave, which is a targeted, random party member frontal that leaves behind molten pools for 5 minutes. So because of the large area denial from this boss, I recommend taking this boss on the outskirts of the room to leave as much space as possible, and to have your party members bait that frontal towards a wall or outer edges of the room in order to maximize space. After his axe, he always changes to his swords, which grants him Molten Fury. This deals heavy tank damage over 6 seconds, so tanks, make sure to use defensives on this cast. It also applies the Molten Spark dot onto 3 random party members, which leaves behind pools, so try to drop those pools on the outer edges of the room. His final weapon, he rotates to the Mace, which allows him to cast Molten Mace, which increases his melee damage by 1000%. but slows him by 50%. This cast also has him spawn lava pools underneath him, and overall this buff lasts for about 10 seconds. So tanks, make sure when he is channeling into this mace, kite away from the boss, but lead him around the edges of the room to maximize space and so you do not get one shot, because if you do not kite, you will be one shot. Moving on from Forgemaster Throngus, we will have some more trash mobs though. Tanks, you'll need to be aware of the Twilight Enforcer mobs. These guys have a ramping rage, which gives them an enrage and attack speed amp with each auto attack. So you can use a CC ability that lasts longer than 3 seconds, or a soothe, or of course you can just kite the mob. The lieutenant mob in this area is the Twilight Lava Benders. These guys will use Ascension once at low health, which is an AoE ability that is a channeled swirl around the lava bender. So if you are hit, is a heavy AoE damaging ability that will apply pulsing damage dot on you that hits your entire team. Other than that, these guys have a random targeted frontal attack that you need to avoid, and an AoE around each player cast that you will need to spread out for. The main caster for this area is the Twilight Warlocks, which use the ability Enveloping Shadow Flame Curse, which goes out to 2 players and is a healing absorb and a nasty dot. So if you have a curse to spell, prioritize using it for the players affected by the cast. Otherwise, healers just pump heals into those players to get rid of the healing absorb, which also gets rid of the dot. Otherwise, for these trash packs, just make sure you're using kicks on the random targeted bolts. The third boss of this dungeon is Drahga Shadowbender. The first part of this fight is pretty simple. He will cast the Invocation of Shadow Flame, which will spawn an ad that is fixated on a random player. This mob will also apply a lethal dot on the entire party if that ad ever touches the fixated party member. So use CCs or slows and make sure you cleave this ad down, ideally near the boss, but otherwise as fast as possible while the fixated player stays away from the ad. Drahga will also occasionally debuff 3 players with Curse of Entropy, which can be dispelled, removed by a freedom effect, or just by healing like the Warlock's debuff we talked about earlier. When you push the boss to 0 HP, he jumps off the platform and mounts Valiona, which begins the next stage of the fight. In this phase, the invocation cast now spawns 2 ads instead of 1, so you'll want to swap to these ads and cleave them down as quickly as possible while making sure the fixated players are not getting touched. Valiona does have a couple new abilities in this phase, one being Twilight Buffet, which is a AoE damage dealer and a knockback, so make sure you are positioned correctly so you are not knocked off the platform or knocked into your invocation ad that is fixated on you. Shortly after Buffet, Valiona will use Devouring Flame, which is a frontal ability targeted on the tank, so tanks make sure that this frontal ability is aimed away from your party and step out of the frontal yourself. At 50% HP, Valiona flees, ending the encounter. The last section of this dungeon does have some trash mobs that are pretty important, so let's go ahead and talk about those. These mobs are called Mutated Hatchlings, which upon death apply a group-wide stacking shadow damage debuff called Shadow Wound, which increases the shadow damage taken by 5% for 15 seconds, which can be very scary in combination with some of the shadow damage abilities in the next area. The other new mob in this area is the Faceless Corruptor, which has a channel that targets a random single player and does heavy shadow damage every 1 second for 6 seconds. So you want to make sure that you pop a personal offensive if this is targeting you, otherwise you will become mind controlled. This brings us to the final boss, which is a heavy area denial fight. Throughout this encounter, the boss channels Void Surge, which does moderate party damage but also spawns void tentacles all around the room that last for 2 minutes. These tentacles are stationary, but if anyone touches them or walks over them, they will be hit with Depth's Grasp and will be hit with heavy dot damage every 1 second for 4 seconds and will be stunned for 4 seconds. If you really need the space, you can use immunities to clear out these tentacles for more space, otherwise just try to avoid them. To deny even more space, the boss will cast Shadow Gale, which fills the majority of the room with a storm over 15 seconds, leaving just a small circle for you and your team to play in. Shortly after that reaches maximum size, the boss then debuffs 3 players with the Abyssal Corruption Dot, which deals pulsing damage around each player affected within your group, which your group then needs to quickly spread out for in the small area that is available during the Shadow Gale to not cleave down each other. This is a good spot if you're one of the debuffed players to use a defensive. Once that ability is over, the boss will then spawn some ads, which are those mutated hatchlings from earlier that apply that shadow damage amp, so try to cleave them down slowly so you are not fully stacked up when the boss casts Void Surge again, which is a AoE shadow damaging ability. Before the Void Surge cast though, the boss will always cast Crush, which is a tank targeted tank buster hit and knockback, so tanks make sure you are positioned correctly so you will not be knocked back into a tentacle and be stunned. As always, tanks as well, Make sure you're using a defensive when you're about to be hit with Crush. Other than that, this boss is basically a rinse and repeat until the boss is defeated. But there you have it, guys. That's my beginner Mythic Plus dungeon guide for Grim Batol. Now remember, for higher keys, there are strats to this dungeon. I'll be putting out a video in the future for this dungeon when it comes to much higher keys. But for now, this is everything you need to know about the basics of this dungeon for Mythic Plus. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you sub to the YouTube, follow me on TikTok and Instagram, and also I stream on Twitch, so if you want to watch me live playing these tanks, you can follow me on Twitch and watch my streams there. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.